Good day, everyone. I'm Rollin McCraty. I am Director of Research at the HearthMath Institute. And today we're going to talk about global coherence, what it is, why it's important, and how to play your role in creating a better world. So first, let's talk about a little bit about coherence. That often comes up as a kind of a question. And most people, I think, have sort of an intuitive understanding of coherence. And if you look it up in the dictionary, the first definition is usually about the quality of somebody's speech or writing. Hopefully I'm able to put my words together today that convey a coherent meaning. So the sentence is greater than the sum of all of the words. And if I was uttering nonsense, you would be saying, well, God, that was incoherent. And in some similar ways, that is also related to how the word coherence is used in physics. And when we talk about coherence from a science or physics perspective, it's almost always in the context of describing the behavior of a system, or especially complex system, that has lots of parts that have to work together, and hopefully in a harmonious way. So it always implies that there's harmony within the system, if we're talking about a coherent system, that the individual parts within the system that make up the wholeness have to somehow be connected and communicating with each other, and that there's stability. And coherence also implies efficient use of energy. So when we have a coherent system, it's like clearly living systems like us and all life is, that's really what it implies. Now we can be at various levels of coherence or harmony within the different systems. I think that's kind of obvious probably. So those are kind of key concepts. And coherence is, think of it as a big umbrella term that also embraces a lot of other things that we can measure scientifically. And these are terms like entrainment, synchronization, for example, synchrony, are all terms that are kind of enveloped in this concept of coherence. That would be more specific aspects of it. Now we can use, with back here at the HearthMath Institute, we use coherence in three different big domains you could think of. So personal, in other words, in our personal bodies and our personal systems, what's the harmony within the systems of the body? How well are we able to self-regulate ourselves, our mental emotional capacities, physical, the whole system as a wholeness is what we really mean by personal coherence. Social, which I won't talk a lot about today, but I'll just briefly cover that a little bit. But this would be what's the harmony and the connectedness and the energy efficiency within our families or our work teams, or even communities and countries, can all be described as coherent or incoherent. And then, of course, global, which is the primary focus of today's talk. We'll be talking about a lot more about what I mean by global coherence. So rather than giving a kind of hardcore scientific description of coherence for our personal coherence, I think this one is more meaningful for most people. And it's an optimal state in which the mind and emotions are brought into alignment and in sync with the energetic heart's intuitive guidance. Now, that may sound kind of odd at first, but if you think about it, if you think back about, it could even be today or the last few days, if there's been a situation where you were either asked to do something or thought you wanted or should do something or that kind of thing, but you just had a deeper inner sense, deeper inner voice prompting that maybe that wasn't quite the right thing. Maybe you should kind of sleep on that one, or that, in other words, just wasn't the right choice. Or it could be a situation where you've said something to someone that maybe hurt their feelings or created a bit of separation, and you had that inner prompting of that you really should go call them or talk to them and just kind of clean that up and apologize. But those kind of inner promptings. And if you think back on it, how often do we follow or not follow those inner promptings? And usually most people would agree that when we don't, that's when it leads to either greater separations with people, or we've made a choice that feeds back on us in a way that we wish we would have listened to that deeper inner prompting. In fact, I would suggest that it's just lack of alignment between our heart's intuitive guidance and the mind drives and ambitions. That's the greatest source of stress on the planet. And that's really, from my perspective, what the global shift is all about. The shift in consciousness is to bring more of the alignment between the heart and mind. Now, if we talk physiologically, could do another presentation on all the physiological measures that literally reflect increased harmony and order and coherence in our bodies. But it's basically when we practice being able to shift into and maintain more coherence, it creates a cascade of neural and biochemical events that benefit the entire body. But it's especially our mental and emotional stability. So when we get to heart and brain incoherence, which I'll show you what that looks like shortly, really the brain is the big winner. We perform much better, and I'll go into just a brief thing on some of the detail there. So heart and brain are the most interconnected systems in the body in terms of the way they communicate, and they're wired together through what's called the autonomic nervous system. And the second statement on this slide may sound like some new big discovery, that the heart sends far more information to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. Well, in fact, it's not. This has been known since at least the late 1800s, and this is basic neuroanatomy when this is known. I won't go into a lot of detail here just because of time, but this is a well-known fact in terms of basic anatomy. And the last statement on this slide, that the patterns in the neural signals that the heart is sending to the brain, they literally go to every major brain center in the brain, and they affect the brain centers involved in perceiving the world, in our emotional experience, how we feel, and our capacity to self-regulate. Now, this goes back to around the late 1960s, early 1970s, and there were two terms introduced into the scientific literature at that time, long before I came along and became a psychophysiologist, to describe the effects that the heart was having on brain function. And those terms are cortical, top part of our brain, right, that we get paid to go to work for, cortical inhibition, and cortical facilitation. So depending upon the quality of the signals the heart was sending up to the brain, it either facilitated the brain and mental functions, or it inhibited them. And what they didn't know at that time, in fact, I'll make the statement, it's reading the older scientific literature of that era, it's really interesting because these researchers are quite literally saying in their papers that the heart is acting as though it had a mind of its own. Excuse me. But what we know now that they didn't know then was that the heart, in fact, does have what you could think of as a mind of its own. And it has its own neural structure. And the field that studies this is called neural cardiology. And there are a number of neurocardiology research groups all around the world. And their work has profoundly affected the way heart surgeries are done, and a lot of understanding of psychophysiology. Technically, it's called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system. And then it was nicknamed the heart brain by the field of neurocardiology. That wasn't us at HearthMath that coined that term, heart brain. And they mean this literally. So these neurons, these neural structures in the heart, have all the properties to really qualify as its own functional brain. So they have memory, both short and long-term memory, neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, and all these types of functions. So we now have a lot more understanding for what was observed many years ago. Now, if we want to get a window into the activity between the heart and the brain, and what our emotional states are as well, this is where this tool called heart rate variability comes into play. And that's going to be a big factor in the global coherence work and the global coherence pulses, because we are, with the global coherence app, this is actually what we're measuring, is your heart rate variability. So in a healthy person, a resilient person, our heart rate is actually changing with each and every heartbeat. Now that may sound kind of odd, but so recall heart rate. What heart rate simply is how many times did the heart beat in a minute? Okay, so we all kind of know what that is. But in reality, if you look a little closer, our heart rate is changing with each and every heartbeat. And that's what you're seeing here on this figure. So this red line on the bottom of this graph is the electrocardiogram. So each one of these big spikes is the contraction of the heart, the ECG. And what we're measuring now is the time interval between each and every consecutive pair of heartbeats. And that's called the interbeat interval in time. And then you can convert that interbeat interval to what the heart rate in beats per minute equivalent would be. In other words, if all the heartbeats were the same as that, it would be, in this case, between these two heartbeats around 65. The time between the next pair is a little shorter. right? A little closer together, so that's up around 70 and so on. And over here around 15 seconds, you can obviously see that there's more time between the heartbeats, right? So that's down around 50, and this is technically called instantaneous heart rate. Basically, when you connect the dots with the blue line up here, this is your heart rhythm. So if there were no heart rate variability, in other words, if the time between each pair of heartbeats was the same, the blue line would be a flat line and there would be no heart rhythm. So it's this beat to beat change in heart rate that really generates the rhythm of the heart. Now, there's a lot of important reasons that we want to measure this. One is that the amount of heart rate variability that we have, this natural variability, we have the most of it, there's more variation between beat to beat. In other words, when we're young, and it gradually gets less across the aging span. In fact, it's the best known measure currently of aging, of biological aging, is heart rate variability. And it's not just true for humans, it's also true for many other species as well. So the how much is really important. And if we don't have as much as we should for our age, that is widely used as a measure of risk of future health problems. But there's another even deeper level of heart rate variability that we are going to look into here, and that's what I call the pattern of the HRV. And that's what we're looking at here. And this is in fact what the Global Coherence app actually shows you at the personal level, is how coherent or incoherent your heart rhythm is. Now, these two graphs that you're seeing on this slide are from the same person, showing what the heart rhythms look like when we're feeling different things. So the one on the left, called incoherence, this is the type of rhythm that our heart's typically beating out when we're feeling things like frustration or impatience or anxiety, fear, worry, these types of emotions. And we tend to call these depleting emotions because they have a literal depleting effect in our bodies and our immune system and hormonal system. And what this is reflecting, this is the important part when you see these incoherent rhythms, and that is that the activity in our nervous system, in our higher brain systems and within our autonomic nervous system are out of sync. So this is a very energy inefficient state to be in, okay? So it's a literal measure of many different things in the body. So if we look at the one on the right where it says coherence, this nice sine wave rhythm, excuse me, is reflecting a much greater of harmony within the body. And just to have one cycle, one little cycle of that sine wave, keep in mind this is the variability. So there's probably 15, 20 heartbeats that occur just in one cycle. But what we see is this order over time emerge, this coherent rhythm. And this is what we naturally shift into, this type of a heart rhythm, when we're emotionally feeling, actually not thinking, this is really key, but the heartfelt experience of things like compassion, appreciation, these types of emotions. This is what our body is naturally feeling. And as it turns out, we actually, within the human body, we have a resonant frequency. So resonance also plays an important part here. And so this is the resonant frequency of the heart, brain, lung, system, which is this coherent rhythm. So when we're in coherence, our systems are all synchronizing up and working together in coherence or greater harmony. And it's a very energy efficient state that helps. In other words, we're getting a lot more done with using a lot less energy. Now there's over 400 studies, independent studies now, that have shown that learning how to shift into coherence and practicing that throughout the day has a wide range of benefits. It's everything from increased academic performance in kids to lowered blood pressure to better hormonal balance, better at sports. I mean, the list just goes on and on. I won't go into all of that again because of time here today. Now, I'll just quickly kind of give you the mechanism here, and it took a lot of labs or a lot of years to really sort all of this out, but it's actually quite simple at the end of the day. So as I mentioned earlier, the heart sends much more information upstairs to the brain than the other way around. So these ascending, or technically afferent, they're called pathways through the nervous system. Basically, they go to every major brain center. And the one I'm going to focus on here right now is the thalamus. It is the very core of our brain, and it has many important roles. But one of those is that it synchronizes the electrical activity of the entire brain, global. So global synchronization is the pulses that do that, if you could think of it that way, are generated by the thalamus and these big cortical loops that go from the thalamus to all through the brain to synchronize neural activity. And if we're in an incoherent state, HRV state, that basically interferes with or inhibits the thalamus's capacity to synchronize global neural activity in the brain. And hence, that's where the term cortical inhibition came from. So for the brain to perform optimally, the neural structures that underlie the abilities and skills we have to be well synchronized and working harmoniously together. So easy ways to measure this are things like our reaction times, our coordination. These types of things are not as good or impaired when we're in this incoherent state. However, the part of the brain most profoundly affected is the frontal cortex, the pre and frontal cortex areas of the brain. And one of my mentors, a guy named Carl Pribram, pretty famous guy that used to spend a lot of time here. He actually coined the term executive functions to describe this part of the brain, the frontal areas of the brain. And from what his perspective is what those areas of the brain really give us is the capacity of foresight. In other words, the capacity to understand and be aware of how our current actions affect the future, right? And that's very different than memory of hindsight, to really be able to understand and look into the future. So those are things like discrimination of appropriate behavior, being able to plan, set goals, abstract thinking. These are all under that umbrella of foresight. So this is where it gets pretty simple, that the neural machinery that underlies those abilities has to be well synchronized to perform optimally. And incoherence or desynchronization affects those the most profoundly, okay? So on the other hand, when we're able to shift into the coherent rhythm, those signals go up, they facilitate the thalamus's capacity to synchronize global activity so that all of those same capacities and functions are actually enhanced even above and beyond our normal walking around state. Because in reality, we're somewhere in between the two as we go about our day. But before making an important decision, it's always a good idea to just take a moment, use a technique, shift into coherence, and then really get our mental capacities facilitated and our emotional stability really settle down, so we're not just doing reactive decisions as well. So it really, getting the heart in coherence, the brain is the big winner. You know, this is a whole presentation just in its right to really go into this more deeply, but just wanted to give you some of the basics. And I won't go through all of these, but these are just a few of the benefits of practicing coherence. Again, most of this is all independent studies at this point. And I think one of the most important ones on here, or there's really two that I would like to highlight, and that's the first one and the last one. The capacity to maintain our composure during challenges. I mean, it's easy to kind of be in the flow and in charge of ourselves and feeling good when, if we're driving, let's use that analogy, when all the traffic lights are green and we pull up to where we're going, and there's a parking spot right in front. As my wife says, the parking angel's out, you know, and so on. But it's when we hit the traffic jams. That's when most of us, whether we're conscious of it or not, start shifting into a different state, right? It might be impatience or frustration. I mean, even if we're not beating on the steering wheel, we're still having those emotions. And it's important here because it's the emotions that run the show. They're what drive the physiological activity in our body far more than thoughts do. And this is so easy to prove in the lab here. So once we start feeling the frustration and so on, that creates a cascade of at least 1,400 biochemical events. And then the second one here, it increases access to intuitive intelligence is the other, I think, of the two most important ones that we're talking about here. Now, I can't help but just zero in on this age of the coronavirus and talk about one of the studies we did back in the mid-1990s. That's very relevant for today, and it kind of ties into what I was just saying. So in this study, we measured a group of people, I forget how many, some 20 or 30, somewhere in that range. And we measured what's called salivary IgA, which is the first line of defense in our immunity, so in our immune system. So this is the one that's most strongly correlated with having protection against actually viruses and flu, influenza, these types of things. So it's a really important part of our immune system. So we measured we did this in a counterbalanced way. Again, I don't need to get into all the details here, but so we had the group come in, measured their IgA levels, and then we had them get frustrated or frustrated, angry, by just self-recalling something that made them frustrated or angry, and actually just trying to feel that for 5 minutes. That was all they did. And then we had them kind of go about the rest of their day while we measured their IgA levels every hour thereafter. Okay, that's the red line. So we see right after the 5 minutes of experiencing frustration and anger that there's a little bump, non-significant bump in the IgA, and that's due to autonomic outflow increasing and so on. But look what happens in the next hour and the hours following that. So there's a strong and significant suppression of this first line of defense in our immune system. Now, when the group did the same thing, only this time, instead of getting frustrated and angry, we actually had them feel compassion and care for someone in their life, something, but really just try and feel that feeling for 5 minutes. Now we see a much larger jump, in fact, a significant, statistically speaking, jump in the IgA immediately following that. But then what you see is a general rise in IgA throughout the rest of the day. So we're really enhancing our immunity. So of course, there's going to be a lot of fear and concern. In fact, we talk about managed concern versus fear in some of what we call our care focuses. So of course, we want to be concerned and take the proper precautions in these times. But if we let that go into fear and too much fear, we're really suppressing the thing we need most, the first line of defense in our immune system. So compassionate latitude, I think, is very much related to this. And this is something that really helped me, because compassion for some people we can be compassionate, and we, give some money maybe to the homeless that we're walking by, and different things like that are truly compassion. But the energetic feeling and really the felt experience of compassion can sometimes be a bit abstract. And our founder, Dr. Childrey, actually added latitude, compassionate latitude, which really helped me personally. I think I hear this from a lot of people. But basically, when we have an attitude of compassionate latitude, it includes things like being less critical, more patient and tolerant with each other, right? It doesn't mean we have to agree with others' perspectives or their behaviors, but we can, cut them a little slack, and kind of realize that a lot of the things that are upsetting us or triggering us, if we're really honest, are probably things we've done in the past ourselves, or will do next week or next month, right? So basically just having an attitude of compassionate latitude, especially during these times of the shelter in place and different things going on, but not just this. I mean, it's a very helpful thing to keep in mind. Okay, so I'm kind of shift gears here now into more of the social global aspects of this, and kind of the theme of the talk today, which is what am I feeding the field? So to understand what we mean by this, when we measure your electrocardiogram, in other words, you put electrodes across the chest, or the same thing on the brain, you put electrodes to measure your brain waves. What we are measuring is electricity. So the electrocardiogram I showed earlier, that is measuring the electrical impulses produced by the heart. And whenever there's current flow, we produce a magnetic field. And one of the qualities of magnetic fields is they radiate outside of the body. They go right through things. In fact, this is the same magnetic field that I would use in my cell phone here, that we all use to carry information, right? The voice, the text message, picture, whatever. It's the electromagnetic field, but the magnetic component is what goes through the walls and carries the information from our phone to the cell tower. And this is why our phones work inside of buildings or inside of elevators. It's because of this capacity of the magnetic field to penetrate. So the magnetic field generated by the electricity generated by the heart and the current flows easily radiates outside the body. And the image you see on the slide here is actually the shape of the heart's, it's a toroidal shaped magnetic field, right? Now, so we know this because we can measure it with devices called magnetometers. So this isn't an aura necessarily. Not that auras don't exist, I just can't measure those yet in the laboratory here. But this is something we can quite easily measure external to quite a ways from the body. Now, where it gets interesting here is the vibrational pattern of the information being carried by these magnetic fields changes in real time based on what we're feeling, our attitudes, our emotions, and our intentions. Okay, and this can actually be detected by the nervous systems of other people and affect the mental emotional states of others around us. So this is not conjecture. This is all published. And if you're interested in seeing some of the scientific publications on this, it's been replicated multiple times. That's available on our website in what's called the research library. So basically, you can think of this as our personal field environment. This is a literal, measurable field. Now, as I mentioned, we can measure this. That's what I'm just showing you here. In this slide, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. In fact, I used to be a communication engineer, was my career before I became a psychophysiologist 30-some years ago. Used to work for Motorola. And using almost the same techniques that I would have used back then to decode or demodulate the information being carried by a radio wave, right? This we used and just applied those to the magnetic field produced by the heart. And quite clearly, you can see that the patterns of vibrational information or emotions, basically, are present and being carried by, just like a cell phone would, to carry the information, our emotional state. Probably much more information about our physiology and is carried by this field, which we haven't been able to quite nail down yet. We haven't really tried either, but for sure our emotional states is being carried in these vibrational patterns. So these are called frequency spectrums, and you can see quite the main point here I need to make before I get too detailed here is that they're different. So appreciation on the left looks quite different than anger. So that's the main point, that these are different information patterns. And if you have the right stuff and the right equipment, you can actually wire yourself up and watch all these patterns change in real time as we change emotional state. So it kind of gives us now the scientific basis of a lot of the sayings that are just inherent in our language, right? We know this. Sayings like, God, the tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife, in the air and so on. Or it just feels really good to be around certain individuals. So I did mention that studies have been done. Here's one, and this was a PhD dissertation study, actually. It was an independent study. And what this researcher did is he had 40 people, and he divided them up into groups of 4. And they were basically studying around a table. So they were within each other's personal field environments. Not that that matters, according to more recent studies. And he had them wired up to devices, at physiology to measure their electrocardiograms and heart rhythms and so on. And 3 of the 4 had been trained 2 weeks prior to the experiment taking place in how to shift into coherence, and had one of the devices to actually measure and feedback your coherence level so they could practice. Maybe they'll make that shift right in real time when they were asked to. Again, I won't go into all the details here. It was a fairly complex protocol, but basically the 3 people were randomly signaled when to shift in and out of coherences with different intentions and so on. And what was the main outcome measure was what's happening to the 4th person who didn't know what this was all about. They were naive to the real purpose of the experiment. And kind of the answer to that is on the bottom of the slide there. Not every case, every time, but across the whole study, it was a highly significant effect. That when the other individuals in this group became more coherent, it had a literal lifting effect on that other person, measurably. They also became more coherent. Okay, so that was kind of, now in this study, he also looked at the synchronization, the heart-to-heart or heart rhythm synchronization between the various combinations of all the people around the tables across the 10 groups, and found some really interesting results. In fact, that they were synchronizing, and that the degree of synchronization, where they literally synced up with each other, was directly related or significantly related to how well they knew each other. In other words, the emotional connection between them, and also their capacity to maintain a coherent state were the 2 main significant factors in predicting how in sync people were at the group. Now that we've carried that research on a little bit farther, and this is a group of some data from a group of 20 people that I'm showing you here. I'll just very brief here. And this is an experiment where we looked at this group just using the heart lock-in technique, which is one of the HearthMath techniques, to basically radiate love and care to the planet, the planetary field environment. And then we also had them send, with intention, heart energy, coherent heart energy, to a specific other person. And of course, they were more coherent in both situations. But what we found is that when they specifically connected with and sent heart energy to another person in the group, they were all these 20 people in a big, large room, were all being wired up at the same time. is that they became more synchronized with, not only did they become more coherent, but in this case, they also became more synchronized with each other to the pairs. And in fact, it's an amazing degree of synchronization that you see here. I would never have thought this, that we would see this level of synchronization. And that's kind of shown on the right side in the what are called power spectrums, showing the frequencies of the rhythms over this time period of the pairs of individuals in this case. So just again, kind of amazing stuff. So this heart-to-heart synchronization is real and it's measurable. And I'll just say a kind of maybe for a future presentation, this is also work now being done that's finding this same kind of thing can happen even non-locally. I mean, even hundreds to thousands of miles apart. So when we connect in the heart, there is an energetic connection. There has to be some type of again, for coherence, the parts have to be in communication for coherence to occur and for synchronization to occur. So we'll get a little bit more into at least one possible mechanism of how that might occur in a few minutes here. So bottom line, what I might have been saying here is that even a few people, when we are in a coherent state, especially, and when we're really radiating these heart qualities, right, into to others and into the environment, it can elevate the interactions that are going on. It can uplift the vibration that facilitates more connectedness and alignment. And we see this all the time in many different contexts. So really, it matters what we're feeding the field.